Ladies and gentlemen, we're now at that time of year when it's almost Valentine's Day, which is, I must say, a time of year which I look forward to with some trepidation. Valentine's Day is probably one of the worst days of the year, certainly one of the most pointless exercises in consumer-driven idiocy. There may once have been a point to Saint Valentine, but I think it's long been forgotten, other than a way of making people spend a lot of money. Well, usually making men spend a lot of money, which of course makes it a lot worse. And believe me, even these times of economic downturn won't prevent your significant other from expecting something on St. Valentine's Day. I've had some very unfortunate experiences on St. Valentine's Day, and the worst was probably a few years ago. It was a Sunday, and I'd completely forgotten what day it was, and I was supposed to be playing rugby, but the game got cancelled because of the weather, so a friend of mine and I decided to have a proper lunch instead for a change on Sunday, instead of running around in the mud, which is what we normally did on Sundays. But, unbeknownst to us, it was Valentine's Day, and of course we couldn't get any space in any restaurant, however much we tried. And when we eventually did get a space in a restaurant and sat down, we then realized that all the other tables around us were taken by moonstruck couples gazing into each other's eyes or holding hands. And then it hit us that it was actually the 14th of February. And my friend was utterly mortified, because he came to the conclusion that people must be thinking we were a gay couple, because everybody else in the restaurant was a couple, because nobody except couples goes out on Valentine's Day. And of course, this was a terrible blow to his self-esteem. And he was so desperate, he started calling all the girls he knew that lived in central Brussels to see if one of them would come and sit at our table and rescue us and make it look slightly less louche. And so I found the whole thing rather silly and a bit unpleasant, as I said. But there are people who look forward to Valentine's Day with a great deal of excitement and hope, and I don't mean just the ones who are expecting presents. I'm referring here to people who sell gifts, and particularly flowers, because for florists, Valentine's Day can be the biggest day in the year. The year may actually depend on whether they have a good turnover on Valentine's Day. It's the difference between sometimes going into bankruptcy and actually making a profit. And I think in these hard economic times, when people are cutting back on a lot of essentials, flower shops will be setting great store by what might happen on the 14th of February. During economic downturns, people tend to cut back on overheads and on discretionary spending, on things that they don't really need to buy. And so they'll be cutting back on gifts and so forth. They'll be cutting back a lot on flowers that they buy normally during the year. But on Valentine's Day, you have to buy something, and flowers is actually the simplest thing to buy, and comparatively cheaper, certainly cheaper than jewelry. So if anything, people are more likely to buy flowers in these harsh economic times, and so it might make up for the loss in flower sales maybe in previous months. So I think it's going to be quite an important day, at least for the flower growing and selling industry. And now maybe I should say something about that industry, at least from a British point of view, because in Britain we've always assumed that most flowers that were sold came from the Netherlands. We don't grow enough flowers in the UK, though we do grow some of the nicest ones, and of course our roses are second to none, but we don't have enough of them. So most of them come from the wholesale markets in the Netherlands. And I think traditionally that has indeed been the case, but it's beginning to change. And I found out recently that more and more of our cut flowers don't come from the Netherlands. In fact, they don't come from Europe at all. They come from far-flung places like Zimbabwe, the Gambia, Kenya, and Mauritius, South Africa, also parts of Latin America, though Latin America apparently mainly focuses on the North American market. I think more than 50% of the cut flowers sold in the United States come from Costa Rica. So flowers are actually flown, usually flown, sometimes shipped, but usually flown halfway across the world to sell in your local florists round the corner. This may sound like a pretty silly idea, and in particular, it may strike you as a terrible waste of resources, particularly in these times when we're concerned about global warming and our carbon footprint. After all, surely to get a bunch of roses from Kenya is much worse from the environmental point of view than to get them from just across the channel in Amsterdam. Well, actually, you'd be wrong if you thought that. It's about 270 miles, let's say 400 kilometers from Amsterdam to London. It's about 6,500 kilometers from Kenya. So there's a clear difference in distance. But when they did their calculations, they found out that the carbon emissions for roses in comparison were much lower if they came from Kenya than if they were brought from Amsterdam. And this is because, of course, Amsterdam is closer. And so the transport carbon emissions are much lower than the air freight emissions all the way from Kenya. But you have to bear in mind that in looking after those roses, in growing them and in nurturing them in the Netherlands, the costs and the energy inputs were far higher than growing those roses naturally in Kenya. This is because in the Netherlands, pretty much everything has to be grown in a greenhouse. The greenhouse has to be heated, it has to be lit, it has to be ventilated. The plants have to be not just irrigated, which usually requires some kind of complex energy-intensive pumping system, but they also have to be given fertilizers, which are usually based on fossil fuels. They have to be given all sorts of pesticides, which also contain chemicals that are based on hydrocarbons and therefore ultimately come from oil. And basically, if you add up all these inputs and all the energy that has gone into the process of getting the roses ready to be sent to London, you get a huge amount of carbon dioxide being produced. In Kenya, during the growing process of plants, there is virtually no input at all. A little bit of fertilizer, a little bit of pesticide, but basically the temperature takes care of itself. The plants are grown outside, they get the light and the rain and the sunshine that they need, and their carbon footprint is virtually nil. So by the time you total everything up, it's actually a lot lower in carbon emissions to get your flowers, in this case from Kenya, than it would be to bring them from the Netherlands. With the other advantage that in Kenya, those roses are being grown in a generally more environmentally friendly way because fewer pesticides and things like that are going to be used. It's not going to damage the environment so much. Furthermore, you're providing jobs for people in a third world country who otherwise would not find it easy to generate an income. And these roses in particular sell for a premium. And it's therefore something that's even good for rural development and for development in general in countries, as I say, like Kenya, where they need all the help they can get. So there you go. If you're going to be foolish enough to buy anybody roses on Valentine's Day, make sure they come from Kenya, not from the Netherlands. Thank you.